Is it bad or is it bad? Well, of course, yes, it is bad. And you'll have seen loads of videos talking about player numbers, all the things Bungie have done wrong. And of course, most of the sentiment behind that is absolutely correct. Plus, there's plenty of truth. Yes, Bungie are going to be feeling a lot of pressure right now when looking at the player numbers for Destiny 2 on a daily basis. And while hyperbole is absolutely a thing, we've been talking about player numbers for years, frankly. Sometimes it's blown out of proportion, other times less so, and right now, safe to say the game is struggling, but there's this interesting component as well, where you get a kind of community civil war. And I think that largely exists between the players who are still in love with the Destiny franchise, and while they probably recognize things are pretty bad right now, they want it to get better. I feel like there is a portion of Destiny players, historic Destiny players, who are also so burnt out at this point that Bungie can probably do very few things right in terms of getting those players back into the game. That's not to invalidate anybody's concerns, because again, what's happening in the moment is painfully real. We'll continue our conversation about all of this in just a moment, but there's an important update I haven't been able to cover outside of this video just yet. So, Bungie said, update regarding unstable cores. Last week we announced that unstable cores will not reset with the launch of Renegades in December. We noted in the twid that we would provide further updates on how we'd rebalance the economy, and have landed on a plan to fully deprecate this currency. Once deprecated, Infusion will cost a small amount of enhancement cores and Glimmer. So reading on, overall they say we've found that unstable cores have been too restrictive across power levels and fail to drive interesting buildcraft decisions, whether that be powering up through campaign missions and wanting to try different weapons, or going into endgame content and looking to infuse lower level gear to higher power levels. We don't have an exact patch for this change just yet, but we're working rapidly to align on a target date. In the short term, we have 2 items of note shipping with the update that we get today at reset, that's 915, so the goal is to help players with smaller amounts of unstable cores to infuse gear alongside power and progression changes going live in the update. So until the currency can be retired, they've added a one-time reward of 777,777 unstable cores to the catch-up chest that will be available in the tower tomorrow at reset. We highly recommend signing in and using these before they're removed, plus they're shipping a minor change that reduces the number of unstable cores needed for infusion at higher power levels until they are deprecated. So there we go, that's the important update. Unstable cores basically going away, and in the interim, Bungie are going to give us so many of them that hopefully it won't be an issue for those who are looking to make builds and infuse gear and stuff like that. It's kind of bonkers that they shipped this with the kind of requirements that unstable cores have actually had. It's bad enough when you're infusing gear that is close in power levels, but obviously at the higher end, if you're up to 450, 500 power, and you grab something that you haven't used for a while from back in Heresy or whenever, the costs would be absolutely ludicrous. So I guess Bungie have determined in a world where they can't have a very high cost for unstable cores, which was basically done for engagement purposes, then they may as well not have unstable cores at all. I'm not going to get into further complaints about it because they're going away. So another big walk back from Bungie there, and they're clearly realizing that they are indeed in quite a bit of trouble in terms of player numbers right now. And they don't want these systems to kind of be a big reason that players don't even consider returning to the game when we get to Renegades. So while it's taken a little while, we are on this trajectory now where Bungie are walking back a lot of the stuff that players really don't like. Regardless of that, the game is still in the kind of position it is right now, and that'll be the conversation for the rest of today's video. You'll have probably seen a lot of references to Curse of Osiris low points in the last few days, and how Bungie said back then that there were so few players actually logging in that they had a small period of time where they were a handful of weeks away from shutting the game down because player counts were so bad. The game right now has actually dipped below that point, although we should recognize this is a different point in time. Bungie have got their fingers in other pies. Of course, Marathon's bound to be a huge success, isn't it? And that's the reference point many viewers will draw. Bungie also have fewer staff as far as we're aware, so it's hard to compare the way Bungie needed the game to perform back in the Curse of Osiris era versus now, although I do imagine we're in an equally treacherous point in time, if not worse. Either way, looking at this conversation, Clarity on X said, since the general discussions in the community seem to involve Steam player counts on a daily basis, I wanted to highlight a friend's project that has platform-agnostic daily active player data. And this comes in the form of Popularity Report, which is perfectly titled for the general conversation and sentiment at the moment. Clarity points out, though, there is another interesting graph showing the number of new players that are gained each day, and that seems to have dropped quite a bit in recent time. Although it's relatively intriguing looking here. Destiny still seems to be gaining between 4,000 and 10,000 new players every day, so these are players that have never signed in before. And realistically, that's not a terrible number overall. I think one of the bigger problems is that Bungie can't really hold on to those players very well at the minute, and that connects to the conversation we've seen from other creators recently recently about the new player experience and the lack of quality in that experience overall, and I've discussed this, especially given that Bungie have made so much of Destiny actually free to play at this point. I've seen almost no marketing for the fact that Destiny is a free to play game, or at least has a lot of free to play content. And while the portal and the power climb and all these other things are significantly flawed, Bungie have certainly failed to even highlight how much good content there is for a free to play game, right? I recognize the issues with Destiny, but I feel like Bungie have really underutilized the fact that in some ways they've made the game more accessible than ever, at least in terms of the amount of content and progression that players can get without purchasing any expansions. And that is probably a pretty big misstep as well, because it's just not helping the overall equation and Destiny's longer term health. But we can see the chart over the course of Destiny 2's lifespan. Obviously, a massive number of players when D2 originally came out. Then, expansion over expansion, where we see these peaks for Forsaken, Shadowkeep, Beyond Light. We can see there have been really significant drops, but after Beyond Light, it actually held fairly well. That was as we moved through the Witch Queen, Lightfall, and then up to Final Shape expansions. Then, of course, in the time since the Final Shape, we see this continuation of the steady player drop-off up until we got to Edge of Fate, which of course had the lowest player numbers of any sort of expansion release, which in itself wasn't massively surprising. Bungie even kind of reflected the fact that the game is at a different point in its life cycle by moving into this model where we get 2 smaller expansions a year and essentially the scrapping of the season model. Then there's the conversation about Bungie's previous statements regarding getting dangerously close to shutting the game down. I'm not zooming in here on very specific numbers, but if we take Curse of Osiris here, with a little over 300,000 players, that's one of the absolute lowest points in the game's history, and that was the point where Bungie described this serious risk of having to shut the game down. One of the reasons that Bungie really couldn't afford to do that is that Destiny was the bread and butter, right? Destiny was all of their revenue at that point in time, and pretty much still is, to be fair. And when we compare that 300 and something thousand players in the Curse of Osiris era to now, at this point it's looking closer to around 100,000 players across all platforms. So it's a third of the previous absolute lowest point in time in terms of player numbers. So what does that mean for the future of Destiny? Well, it's hard to imagine what the specifics are. I wouldn't want to try and make a statement about that, which is definitive, because I just do not know. But it's very clear that it's not where Bungie want to be, and plain and simply, it's a bad thing. What that will mean for the future of Destiny into 2026, that really is the question, and I imagine how things go in Renegades will have some kind of bearing on that. And it's possible that the planned content for 2026, how it releases, whether it releases, and when it releases, will be impacted on performance over the next 3 or 4 months, especially going into this Renegades expansion. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that Bungie have already kind of allocated all of the resources to go, we're having a full 2 years in this new saga, which would pretty much guarantee they'll still release some kind of content in 2026. That is a legitimate question though, at this point, I feel like. I'm not going to sit here and try and describe how Bungie can save Destiny. Obviously, we can only talk emotionally and from an experience standpoint with regards to how does the game make us feel? What do we think would make it better? And there are loads of things that Bungie can do there. One of the things that we know they probably shouldn't have done is funneled away most of Destiny's content into a grayscale version of the world map, while simultaneously making its rewards feel essentially irrelevant, a soft sunset if you like, only to be replaced by the portal and the grind that we have right now, which obviously is improving with all the updates that Bungie are doing, but it does feel like a very shallow version of the game overall. The problem Bungie have is that is going to take time to fix and figure out, as well as resources, and it's very clear from the content that we've had, whether it's the expansion or the mid-season updates, for instance, that resources overall appear to be pretty stretched. So what happens now is anybody's guess, but clearly Bungie have a significant problem at this point. Alongside that, there's a lot of conversation about how are people interpreting this information and how are, influential people in the community, content creators, big YouTubers, streamers, whatever, are they fueling that fire to some extent? And of course, naturally, in an ecosystem like this, the things that people with influence say will have an impact on general sentiment and the path forward. I can't really speak for anyone else, but for me personally, I just try and be as honest as I can at the time, right? I remember when Edge of Fate came out, and before Edge of Fate actually dropped, I was criticized for speaking harshly about what I thought might happen with Destiny and how the portal, but also the kind of FOMO nature of Bungie's content pipeline at the minute, might have a negative impact on the game. I was one of the first people to criticize Edge of Fate's power grind as soon as it came out, but I wasn't doing it to hype players up or just get clicks. Obviously, there's a component of that because it's my job to talk about Destiny and make a living from people watching my videos, but it was still a reality where I was playing the game, people could see I was actively playing the game, but I was saying, I don't think this is going to pan out well in the long term. Whereas on the other side of the coin, there are folks that kind of don't have that conversation for a number of weeks, even months, and then turn it on its head to where it becomes almost exclusively the only type of conversation that actually happens around the game. So that's not a criticism of anyone else, but all I've personally done is try to be honest about where the game is at a given point in time and give my concerns immediately. But ultimately, none of us can impact whether the game performs well or whether Bungie make good decisions. I feel like based on my experience with Bungie and from what I've seen other folks say, there's always been a sort of attitude of Bungie know best. There have been high-level criticisms from different parts of the community, handed directly or more indirectly to Bungie at different points in time. And quite often it's felt like those pieces of feedback have sort of been ignored or at least not prioritized. But maybe that could just be a development pipeline thing. As we do know, it takes Bungie a very long time to respond to feedback and to actually develop systems in Destiny. But let's go back to the beginning. Right now, things are certainly very difficult for Bungie. I don't know exactly how they move forward from here. One of the problems has been communication and having a rapid enough response to player concerns and feedback. And I think the only way in the short term that Bungie can start to improve that is if Renegades is both very good expansion in itself, right, within the bubble of what that content release will actually be, because we also have to remember Renegades could be one of the best expansions we've ever had, for instance. I'm not saying it's going to be, but ultimately it will come and go regardless, and we'll be left with the portal, Bungie's kind of current content delivery cadence. And I was going to say the grind, but actually Bungie are not increasing the power level anymore, so there also may not be much of a grind after a month or so following the release of the next expansion. And so while a singular release in December could potentially be quite good, if Bungie don't have enough answers to the general health of the game, the week-to-week health of the game through the course of the year, we'll end up back in the exact same position. So I don't know how Bungie find the resources and find their heads in terms of speeding up that conversation, but we're just going to have to wait and see. Also, that roadmap. I've said before it needs to be sustainable and deliverable, but it also needs to be not in 2 months' time. That's all I can say. Things are bad. I'm still going to be covering Destiny, still going to be talking about it, tracking Bungie's progress and the changes that they'll make for Renegades and beyond. But yeah, I don't know what to think, man. You just have to give me your thoughts below. Nonetheless, cheers for watching, and I hope you guys have an awesome day.